It's dramatic. Divorce really, generally speaking, will take whatever you've accomplished up to that stage of your life and it cuts it in half. And suddenly you're at a point that most people would have been in perhaps early in their career if you're then in mid-career.
Life's Third Act is a podcast dedicated to helping you get the most out of your retirement. Sponsored by Tucker Allen. Here's attorney CPA Joe Cordell.
Welcome to another episode of Life's Third Act. Today we're going to talk about somebody who many of you have read his, what do we call it, suspense, espionage novels. Marley, does that kind of capture a lot of what he's done?
Yeah, definitely. I would mention military as well because that's a big part of it.
Yeah, so some people are starting to think, who might that be? And the reason, though, that we've chosen this person is not because this is simply somebody that is famous, but also because it gives us an opportunity to learn a little bit about decisions they made or failed to make in terms of their planning and the consequences of that and the things that might mean to you in terms of planning your own life. So, Marley, I think you selected this topic. So tell us about who our guest is today.
Yeah, so today we are talking about Tom Clancy. If you read novels, if you watch movies, if you play video games, you probably know a little bit about him or have, been exposed to pieces of his work. So he's a New York Times bestselling author. Of
many times over, right?
Yes, very many times over, about 17 times.
Wow.
And he writes military and espionage thrillers, and they're kind of best known for like their technical details and their Cold War settings and just like that suspense factor. Many of you have probably heard of The Hunt for Red October, which was written in 1984, and that was his first success. And
wasn't that a great movie? Justin, did you see that?
That's one of my favorites.
I have to tell you, that was such a great movie.
Sean Connery's also one of my favorites, so that helps too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is an example of Clancy's talent coming up with a plot like that military experts agree and geopolitical experts agree that his novels across the board stood out for their technical accuracy. I mean, he put in a lot of research.
Yeah, and I mean, we'll kind of get into it, but at one point the FBI actually detained him because they thought he was like a Russian spy or a Soviet spy, and they were like, where are you getting all this information from? And he's like, I really am just a detailed like writer who reads a lot about the military. And I mean, he's proven that over and over again.
That was back in the days before you just simply say, I get it off the internet.
Yes, exactly. He would have to hunt a lot of that stuff down. But I mean, he's sold over 100 million copies worldwide, and he's adapted like multiple of his books into movies. And then, like we said, he has the video game franchise, and he has like the Ghost Recon games, the Rainbow Six games, which I don't know if a lot of our viewers will know those, but they may have bought them for like their grandchildren or their son and daughter, anything like that.
I have to admit my nerdiness. I've played almost all of them.
Are you serious? So do these games still exist?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been playing those on the Xbox for almost 20 years now. But, I was born with a Nintendo, basically. So, it's from an early age.
Yeah. I don't think you qualify as a digital native, right? Don't they say digital natives are...
Technically, I'm Gen X, oddly enough. But, yeah, I'm in that weird Zennial thing where it's like grew up with the analog phone and all that stuff, but very quickly transitioned over.
But Tom Clancy was somebody you knew well.
Oh, definitely. Yep. Yeah. Between both, I never actually read any of his books, but seen basically every movie that he's made and played almost all the games based on his stories.
Yeah, attaching his name to something always assured additional sales, and that's worth mentioning too, is though he wrote many books, Marley, he also had his name added to movie scripts.
I read that, and to video game scripts as well that like weren't his own.
Yeah, he had such cachet. So he could just sell that name. And incidentally, I think it appeared as more than an endorsement, but I guess it is technically not deception if he read it and had a comment about it. So that means he had something to do with the writing. But so clearly, as we talk about this person, we'll talk in a little more detail about his success. But in order to get to kind of our purpose here, we want to move through and also cover his life and his family, and then kind of the decisions that he made in terms of his planning. So his estimated, net worth, at the time of death, we'll throw that in at this stage of the conversation. We came up with different numbers, but I saw an authoritative source that said that his net worth was $300 million at the time of his death.
Yeah, I read that as well. And then I was reading that 86 million number that you pointed out as also.
And as far as the estate value itself, yeah.
Yes. Yeah, and I think we've determined that he had that $300 million net worth, but the estate was valued at $86 million.
Yeah, it is possible to reconcile these two numbers. So my suspicion is that he had assets that were in an irrevocable trust that were able to bypass probate entirely and were not subject to probate taxation. Whereas if it's a revocable trust, you die with it. It's true it doesn't go through probate, but as far as the federal government's concerned, as far as taxes, it is taxed as if it's probate because you had complete control up until your death. So in this case, if you read further, which we always encourage you to follow up, to take this show as kind of a springboard to learn more about these people and the circumstances that we talk about. But if you see the $300 million, probably the reconciliation of that with the $86 million is just that he had some structured assets. Now, we don't know who those went to or in what form, so that part of our discussion is going to be opaque to us. But we can assume, I think, that there were beneficiaries that probably resemble pretty much the beneficiaries that we'll talk about through his estate.
Everything you build for you and your family deserves protecting. All of those important assets you have worked so hard to acquire and enjoy, you want to make sure they're handled with care. At Tucker Allen, our attorneys will customize an estate plan that will work for you and your family's goals and needs. Tucker Allen, estate planning, probate, and trust administration. Visit tuckerallen.com.
So tell us, who are the key players here?
Yeah, so obviously we have Tom Clancy. We do want to point out that he had two wives. The first was Wanda Thomas King. And
not at the same time.
Yes, not at the same time. Sorry. He was very Catholic, as we'll get into. But the first was Wanda Thomas King, and they were married from 1969 to 1999.
So make a note of that. Sorry to interrupt you, but make a note. That's 30 years, the first marriage. Go ahead.
Yes, very long, very, very long time. And as we were discussing, and we'll talk about a little bit more, is we think that they kind of had a falling out over him getting famous and all of the money and so on and so forth, because they didn't split up, or they split up shortly after, he published his first novel, and then it really started taking off and the money started really coming in. She did work as a nurse during their whole entire marriage, probably up until the last few years. And then they did have 4 kids together. They had Michelle, Christine, Kathleen, and Thomas. And then he did have his second wife, Alexandria, and they were actually introduced by Colin Powell. They married in 1999, so as you'll kind of notice, he got divorced in 99 in January, and then he got remarried in June of 99 to Alexandria, and they did have one daughter together named Alexis.
Okay, so 4 children from the first marriage, 1 from the second marriage. And the first marriage was 30 years. The second marriage was 14 years.
Yep.
Okay. So let's talk about his early life and his career.
Yeah. So he was born in Baltimore, Maryland, and he grew up in the Northwood neighborhood of Baltimore. His family was very working class. His dad was a post office worker, and his mom worked in a clothing store. He was very Irish American, like we said, very, very Catholic. His mom worked to actually put him into the high school that he went to, which was the, excuse me if I say this wrong, Loyola. Loyola. Oh my gosh, I don't know why I can't say that. Loyola High School. And then he went on to actually attend the Loyola College in Baltimore, which they were associated. He was originally a physics major, but he didn't really do well in school. He was really like more focused on researching the military, reading about the military. So he did switch from physics to English, and he graduated there with a 1.9 GPA, which I'm not sure how they graduated him, but they did.
I mean,
so
he was obviously one of these kids, and we've all known them, who don't have, they're bored in the classroom. So in elementary school, certainly in high school, they often don't pay attention. They're indifferent about grades, but they're busy learning and reading. We know those guys, and sometimes they'll be involved in tech. And like Steve Jobs, something tells me, as a matter of fact, I think I read this, was his grades were pretty poor in high school as well as college. And I don't think he completed college. But in any case, so you have people like that who they're just not interested in the classroom, and they don't see the practical value of their GPA. So they're busy learning and reading, and apparently Clancy was just omnivorous in terms of learning about military things. I mean, he had military posters in his bedroom. He had everything was military in his life. He knew birth dates of generals and all this. So you could imagine a guy having an interest like that and never finding a way to turn that into commercial success, so they end up being a janitor or something, or whatever career he would otherwise have had. Well, an insurance salesman. And having lackluster careers because there was no commercial application for this obsession. And and for him, thankfully, when he gets in his he's 26 years old, he gets at this point in his career and thankfully comes across a way to turn this into a living, much more than a living.
Yeah, definitely. And he did kind of try to feed into the obsession of the military more, because he tried to join the Army Reserves, but he was actually rejected due to nearsightedness, which is kind of surprising for Army Reserves, because normally they'll take you. Like these days they will. So I'm not sure what all went on there.
Well, yeah, it's kind of sad that, here this armchair fanatic about military can't get himself in. But I did want to talk about something. I didn't want to blow past it. It's of interest to me. That's that his parents, though they didn't have much money, they were determined that their son was going to go to a private Catholic school and that he was going to go to a Catholic college. So when I read that initially, preparing for this, I thought to myself, now these parents are what we know well in St. Louis, very dedicated Catholic families. Many of them may not have much money, but they'll have a number of kids, and whatever it takes, their kids always go to private Catholic schools, and if they're going to get money from their parents to help them in any way, they have to go to a Catholic college, which. So I think that, and I wonder to what extent, I didn't find any information on this, but I wonder to what extent his Catholic faith was important to him in his adult life. It's hard to know.
Yeah, it is hard to know. I know that he did go to church, and then he did talk about in some of his books there were like sex scenes, and he was asked about it, and he said that you would have to, like, they were very brief. You would have to really know what you're looking for to be able to point them out. And he was like, I'm Catholic, like whatever happens in the bedroom, we don't talk about it. So I think he into it quite a bit, but I'm not sure, to what extent, if he went to, mass every single Sunday or what have you.
But it did influence his writing, sounds like.
Yes, it definitely did.
So, okay, so he's an indifferent student. He already mentioned about insurance company. What do we know about that he was involved in insurance?
So when he got rejected from the military, he actually went to go work for an insurance company in Hartford, Connecticut. And then he eventually went to work for an insurance agency that was founded by his wife's grandfather in Maryland. And he started writing The Hunt for Red October just on the weekends as a hobby. And I mean, as we'll see, it kind of just blew up from there.
Okay.
But
Incidentally, there may have been a little money on the mother's side. Maybe that's how he paid for the education. But
that's
in
what
any
I'm saying.
case, so he started, his first book was The Hunt for Red October.
Mhm.
And explain the story about that getting published.
Yeah, so it was officially published in 1984 by the Naval Institute Press, but before it was rejected by a ton of other publishers. Once he went and gave it to the Naval Institute Press, it was kind of like his end all be all. He was like, I'm probably going to be done after this. But the editor's assistant read it and she handed it to the editor, and she was like, there is something about this writing, like if you do not publish him, you're going to miss out on somebody huge. And so the editor didn't really agree, but he was like, whatever, I'll try to like publish it and we'll sell a couple of copies.
Yeah,
And
that
so
wasn't their normal thing to publish this
no,
naval, what was it called?
Naval Institute Press.
Yeah, Naval Institute Press. So it was a
Mhm.
little bit out of the direct line of focus for their publication.
Yes. Yes, definitely. And I think he definitely went to a lot of like the bigger publishers who would publish those military stories and what have you, and they said no to him. So Naval Institute Press gave him $5,000 and they were like, we might sell 5,000 copies. And then they sold over 45,000 copies right after they published it.
Just immediately, and they're after millions.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then after President Reagan actually read it, he like praised it and called it like one of the best things he's read. And then it sold over 300,000 hardcovers and 2 million paperbacks. And it made it a national bestseller right off the bat.
Yeah, I think Reagan's words were the best yarn.
The best yarn, yeah.
I don't get it.
Well, you have to know what a yarn is, and you were born a little too late for that. Yeah, it's just saying a story, a good story. And I'm sure Reagan read it and loved it. But I think that his style of storytelling is so vivid, and then you throw in the research, and it's just very real, and very convincing. So though he sold this book for $5,000, we know, but we don't know exactly what that contract was, but I'm confident the contract didn't relate to movie rights, et cetera. So while he did perhaps accept money for The Hunt for Red October that was less than he would have gotten had there been an expectation of success, he still had the opportunity and doubtlessly made many millions of dollars off of that story. But it was just the first of many to come.
Yeah, and I mean, from there, his career really took off, and he credited a lot of like just his research and writing to his insurance career, oddly enough, because he said that you have to have like a really, like good attention to detail in insurance, and you have to be able to like tell your client what's going on and make sure that they don't lose everything. And so he just kind of brought the same to his writing. And he was like, a doctor has to, a cop has to, a fireman has to, why can't a writer? And that was just a really big thing for him. And I think, like you said, his writing's very lifelike. I think that's why it was so easily adapted into movies and why so many of them were adapted into movies, because they didn't have to try hard to write a script or to picture it in their heads or anything like that.
Yeah, and he also managed to write it on weekends, which he had a sales job that gave him flexibility.
Yeah.
But one thing we also know about this guy is that you wouldn't suspect from his early life that he was disciplined, because you look at the grades and you think, well, this is somebody who's probably goofing off, which they could have been. All when you have somebody with bad grades is it could be that they're doing their best. But if they're bright and capable, then you can assume they're either sitting around wasting a lot of time, whether it's TV or video games, or you can assume they're really bright and they're off doing something incredibly productive. But just looking at his academic record, you don't know that he has the ability to be very disciplined. And writing is not something you sit down and do when you feel like it. I mean, I've heard a lot of interviews with writers, and they all say, without exception, this is work. And
Yes.
sometimes you feel like writing, but other times, just like your jobs, you don't feel like it, but you sit down and do it. And a lot of writers, Truman Capote, got to a point in his life where he didn't have the discipline. Though he had advances, he was paid in advance for books and was going to have to pay back hundreds of thousands of dollars that he had been advanced. But he couldn't bring himself to sit down and do it. He just didn't have the discipline at that point. And what's impressive about Clancy is, man, he was a machine.
Yes. Yeah. He just sat down and wrote. And like you said, nobody would have ever expected it from like his earlier years that he was that dedicated or, that disciplined to be able to do it. And he didn't just sit down and loosely write things. He forced himself to do it, and he did it very well also.
And throw in the fact that the subject matter was such that a fiction writer can just sit down and write. I'm sure they do some research about their settings and their characters and whatnot, but this was so technical that he had to do a lot of research and preparation, and then on top of that, do the writing.
Yeah.
So he was a disciplined guy.
Yeah, he kind of created his own like genre called techno thriller, and obviously like bringing that like technical knowledge to thrillers, and he just really ran from there and had those reoccurring characters like Jack Ryan and John Clark that people just absolutely fell in love with. And then some of his books that were adapted into films were ones like The Patriot Games, Clear and Present Danger, and The Sum of All Fears. And they all did well. Even the novels did well.
Yeah. Justin, did you see Patriot Games?
Of course.
Wasn't that good?
Yeah. I need to revisit it because I probably haven't seen it in 15 years, but yeah.
Yeah. Just incredible how good a writer he was. So let's see. Debt of Honor was a New York Times bestseller in 94. And talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so like I kind of was talking about in 89, the FBI brought him in and they questioned him because they were like, how do you know this much, so on and so forth. And he was like, oh, I just read all about this. Well, in 94, he had the New York Times bestseller Debt of Honor. And in it, there's terrorists that crash a plane into the U.S. Capitol building. And then obviously after the September 11th attacks, everybody kind of noticed like the similarities between the book and the events on 9/11. And a lot of people question if the book kind of,
inspired that idea.
Yeah, was the inspiration for that, but there wasn't really enough to like piece together there to 100% say, yes, that's where they got it from or not. I couldn't really find a whole lot on like how Clancy felt about that, about how, if he felt like he was the one who helped inspire it with his writings or whatnot. I feel like he just kind of stayed away from talking about it just because of everything that happened during it.
Yeah, that was a very somber era.
Yes,
America.
It definitely was.
So let's talk a little bit about his first marriage concluding and then, of course, a second marriage. So his first marriage ended, in 99?
Yes. It ended in 99. They had separated in 95 and they had kind of been back and forth from then. But eventually his second wife filed for divorce in 97 and then it was finalized in 99. I do believe that he was dating his second wife sometime in between there. I couldn't find a specific year on when they met, but her name was Alexandria Marie Lewin. And like I said, they were introduced by Secretary of State Colin Powell, and they were introduced probably, like I said, a couple years before. I don't want to say that because he's very,
Catholic.
Catholic, yes.
Well, but they did marry the same year he got divorced.
Yes, they did marry in June. So just a couple months after they got divorced, or he got divorced from his first wife. And I couldn't find a ton on if he was cheating on his first wife or not, but he probably would have been kicked out of the Catholic Church had they found anything out. So I'm not 100% sure.
So his second wife, her father was a billionaire? Did I read that?
Yes. Yeah, he was a billionaire, and then his second wife was also a freelance journalist. So, I'm not sure exactly what she wrote, but I'm assuming that she probably, wrote a lot on the military after she met him or wrote a lot in it before, and that's probably what they connected over.
Yeah. So I think it's interesting to pause here and kind of reflect on the fact that, he had a 30-year marriage.
Mhm.
By all accounts that I've been able to find, the marriage seemed to be happy, at least in the early years.
Yeah,
His wife, in fact, one year after they started making money, she bought him a tank. And it was a rare thing. This was something
yes.
that's a collector's item.
Yeah, it
But
was very expensive.
so he had started to make money then, and his wife chose this very special gift for him, which I'm sure it continued to be. So it's for Christmas one year. So anyway,
Yeah,
what's interesting to me though, and we all, I think, have observed this. And as a divorce lawyer, which is what I did for most of my career, I commonly would see this among couples where there had been a long period of time where there wasn't much financial success, and then especially when it came more or less as a surprise or it was unexpected, some good fortune, maybe some career opportunity that wasn't anticipated. But in any case, suddenly there's a lot of money and their lives change dramatically. And then I'm sure statistics would bear me out on this. The probability of divorce goes up. So in this case, we see a couple that, they were married in 1969. So we really don't have this financial success until, though The Hunt for Red October in 1986 was published, and perhaps the movie and the money really came in, we'll call it 1988, 1989. Maybe 90 even, before they saw the sort of income that would dramatically change their lives. And at that point, they separated in 1995. So really, you can say from the time that they went from middle class to rich would be by 1990. So between 1986 and 1990. So at that point, their marriage hangs on for 5 more years. And I wonder to what extent this sort of financial success took a toll on their relationship. And I don't know why this happens, but it commonly does. And
yeah. I couldn't find a lot on, like, his thoughts on money because I know that we cover some people who just, like, really upset they couldn't care less about their money and so on and so forth, and I truly wonder if it was one way or the other, or even if his wife was one way or the other, because he did have, like, as we'll see, he did collect a lot, but I don't know if he would buy anything, like, massively outright, like the tank or something like that. And maybe that was just like their downfall point of, like, she's like, "Oh, we can spend this money," and he's like, "No, we have to save it," or vice versa or something.
yeah, I think there are those sorts of tug of wars that happen when you have this dramatic in upscaled lifestyle from what you had known previously.
Yes.
So in talking about where we're going in this discussion, it's worth pausing to say, what is the impact of a divorce on one's estate plans? I can tell you that it's dramatic. Divorce really, generally speaking, will take whatever you've accomplished up to that stage of your life, and it cuts it in half. And suddenly you're at a point that most people would have been in perhaps early in their career if you're then in mid-career. So if you're 45 years old, whatever you've accomplished, you cut it in half and you maybe slide back down the hill. Many people do. But some people, if they have built a business and they have created a lot of income, they become wealthy, we'll say, then they still experience that. Depending on the source of the wealth, if it was entirely the product of one of the parties and it's a massive amount of money, the general rules of divorce, which say that whatever either party creates during the course of the marriage is belongs to the marital estate. So that kind of makes sense. So the idea is that if you're a couple, then you've entered into a partnership, and the effect of that partnership is to say that whatever either of you do, you contribute to the partnership. That's the deal. But if you have one person who, we'll say traditionally, was a homemaker, up until recent years, you might have found this scenario often. One party who maybe raised children, et cetera, did that role. Another party who, in our example, built a great business, made a ton of money. A judge, while the general rules are division 50-50, as a practical matter, what judges do is they do consider the magnitude of that wealth, and they often will not award a straight 50-50 division of a $500 million estate where there's one party that entirely created it. But just so you know, that is a deviation from kind of the starting point of property division in the substantial majority of states. In this case, we can assume that whatever intellectual property claims there were, remember, that's a marital asset. Anything that you can assign value to, for the most part, is an asset. Additionally, there's the question of maintenance. And it's true that if you have a division of assets that are sufficiently large, then the court might say, well, we expect then the spouse that earns less money, in this case the wife, to live off of the income that's generated from her marital share after the property division from the divorce. But other judges will take the position that we're not going to require her to liquidate that. So if it will produce income without touching principal, if it will produce income sufficient to retain the same standard of living, then yeah, we won't award any maintenance, which is alimony. We won't award any maintenance. We say, look, you've got assets, you'll have income, you're good. But to the extent, though, that the lifestyle was sufficiently grandiose, I don't know if that was true during the last 5 years of their marriage. It might have been. But if it is grandiose, and that 50% division of the assets, probably up until the time of separation, it could be up until the time of the divorce. But either way, if the court thinks that that's not going to produce enough money in terms of income without touching principal to retain that standard of living, judges will often award maintenance. So that's the reason you hear of rich people getting divorced, and the wife, or typically the wife, one of the parties, will be still getting maintenance. And you say, how can that be? And it's based upon whether the court is going to require them to draw down principal. So, and this is the longer the marriage, the truer what I've just said to you is. As you shorten the marriage, then courts are going to feel less obliged to conform to these general rules about 50-50 division of assets that were accumulated as part of the marital estate, et cetera. And also the eligibility for maintenance goes down because there's less of a dependency typically in a short marriage than there is in a long. So all this is to say that Clancy took a hit. And so it makes it all the more impressive that, when he passed away in 2013, which was only 14 years after the divorce. I mean, it's just 14 years later, and he has a net worth, if these numbers are correct, which our sources indicate that this $300 million is correct. We just can't reconcile it with the part that went through the estate, which was $86 million. But anyway, it means that he accumulated a lot of assets during this 14-year period of time. And you suspect that his wife from the first marriage is pretty well off. Mm-hmm. We didn't pull that decree, but to the extent that it's not under seal, we could have pulled that decree. But anyway, there's only so much we can do to prepare for this show. We encourage you, though, to the extent you can go online, incidentally, to counties in which these things occur. And Clancy's whole life was in Baltimore, or thereabouts, in Maryland. So he did have a place, though, in Washington, D.C., which is, of course, down the road. So these records would be easily located. So let's go on then to... He marries. He has a child in the second marriage, Alexandria.
Yes, named Alexis.
Alexis.
His wife's name was Alexandria. Yep.
Okay, and then he gets. They stay married, and then he dies at age 66 in 2013.
Yes, from heart failure.
Heart failure. So apparently they knew that he was having heart problems, right?
Yes, so he had had a heart attack, I believe, 5 years before, and then he had had just heart issues ever since then. So I think it was just like they knew it was only like a matter of time before something happened.
Well, and to his credit, he did estate planning. So,
yes.
So he, we've let Scout. Scout has joined us in the studio. So he did the sort of planning that typically we would normally recommend, meaning that the sort of plan that he developed is one that really made sense in many ways, in a broad sense at least, made sense for his situation. He created 3 trusts. One trust was a marital trust, and the marital trust is intended to allow assets in that trust to qualify for what's called a marital deduction. Believe it or not, no matter how much money you have, there is an unlimited marital deduction so that you can delay having to pay taxes on assets that you leave to your spouse until she dies or he dies, as the case may be. And then at the death of the latter, then taxes are paid. Now, people are concerned about this because when you talk about taxes for an estate, I mean, it escalates very quickly. So you can just assume as a practical matter, you're looking at around 40% taxes. Huge percentage. So you don't want to pay estate taxes or gift taxes unless you have to. So there was planning here that was largely tax planning, but thankfully we didn't have the tail wagging the dog here. And we caution clients that whenever you're doing planning, yes, taxes are important. Obviously, you can't ignore them if you have a magnitude of wealth to where the exemptions that are available to you are not going to wipe out your tax liability. In other words, according to current numbers, you have above, say, you're married and you have above $24 million. Now, some of you are sitting thinking, well, I can tune out the rest of this discussion. No, what I want to talk about is not the tax planning, but I just want to tell you why he did what he did so that you understand that. I know that the vast majority of people watching this show, as long as you have an exemption above $25 million for both of you, husband and wife, then you're thinking, we're good. We're not going to owe any taxes. And that's true. So long as the exemption remains, you should know that at the end of next year, the existing exemption level, which is like, it changes every year. So it's like 13 million apiece, 12 point something. That's going to expire. So you could easily plunge down to where you have $1 million exemption or less. Now, I don't think it'll go that low, but it could. And a lot of you may think, well, I'm not a millionaire, but if you do the math on your deferred tax assets, on 401ks, IRAs, real estate, other things, insurance, whatever it might be that you are close to that number, and many of you are substantially over it. So we won't dedicate this show to talking about tax planning, but I just want you to realize that depending on what happens at the end of next year, we may all have more interest in it than we do today. But for Tom Clancy to do the planning at the time that he did, you did have a lower exemption. So he knew that, yeah, he could take advantage of that exemption at the time, but it wasn't nearly going to wipe out the amount of tax. So let's say that the exemption at the time was $10 million. So for an individual. So if it were $10 million, then he's looking at 40% of what, 76 million? Now that's very rough, but I want you to understand the magnitude of this discussion. Now it turns out that the actual tax owed is a lower number because he did some really good planning. But without planning, that's the sort of impact that it can have if you have much money that falls in the taxable range, this 40%. So when you hear people talk a lot about estate and gift taxes, and they're kind of the same regime now, estate or gift taxes, the same tax rates apply, then they're talking about it because for those people, that minority of people that are affected by that are above the exemptions, it's huge. I mean, geez, 40%. Many people have to sell businesses at fire sale prices or dump real estate or make catastrophic decisions in order to be able to pay the taxes that people didn't plan for. Now, again, I don't do this show based on the assumption that most of the people watching it as long as these rates apply, as long as the exemption levels apply, I don't think this will be relevant to most of you. To some it will, but to most it won't. But I just want you to appreciate the fact that this could become a subject that is very important to you, depending on what happens when these rates, with this current exemption level, expires. So in this case, there were 3 trusts created, and one trust, as I mentioned, is the marital trust, and that's intended to fully take advantage of this other wonderful thing, which is called the unlimited marital deduction. And the unlimited marital deduction is a marvelous thing because it means that until the second spouse dies, no taxes are paid. So you get to postpone it for, depending on how long your surviving spouse lives to enjoy your wealth. It could be 20, 30 years, whatever it is, but you can imagine the value of deferring to the death of the second party. Well, if you plan correctly, you can take advantage of the unlimited marital deduction. So at least that way, any couple arguably can push it off and let it become their kids' problems, right? But we plan because we don't want our kids to have these problems. So in this case, the second trust, which makes sense, was called a family trust, and it was for Alexandria and the child.
Lexus, yes.
Lexus. So that kind of makes sense. Second wife and his only child from that wife. So you would think, okay, there definitely needs to be provision for them. And then there's a third trust, which was just for the 4 children, adults, I'm sure at that time, but or almost. So yes. 4 children from the first marriage. So that makes sense. You have a trust for them too. Well, he developed a codicil. A codicil is just a supplement, an amendment of sorts to his original trust documents, which were part of his will, by the way. And when he did this, he made clear that he wanted not just the first trust to qualify for the unlimited marital deduction, which he did by way of Q-tip, et cetera, but he also wanted the second trust to qualify, which, remember, that's the trust for the wife and daughter. So once he announced that as his objective in this codicil, then the implications of that are that all the taxes are to be paid from somewhere else. Well, where's the somewhere else? Well, must be the third trust. Couldn't be the first because, again, that's marital deduction. Second, he declared, I want that to be a marital deduction trust. So, by implication, it means, $15+ million, which was the actual tax that was owed due to his good planning. $15 million was to be paid entirely from the third trust, the 4 daughters from the first marriage. As you might imagine, that the 4 daughters did not take this lying down. They objected vehemently. Attorneys are hired. This is the problem about things being in wills and probate, is that you have litigation, and there was litigation. Went up even to the Court of Appeals. And the Court of Appeals of the state of Maryland, ultimately in a 4-3 decision, in other words, it was cloudy because it wasn't sufficiently clear. Remember, the first will said, and I may not have told you this, the first will said that I want the tax obligations to be shared across those last 2 trusts. So he started out with an intention that it won't come from the first trust, which, remember, is marital deduction trust, and it can come from the other 2 trusts, to a codicil that is done years later, like the year before he died.
Yeah.
So he does the codicil, and in that one, he says, I want both of these first 2 trusts to qualify for the marital deduction. Well, if you do that, it means that you want the taxes to be paid from some other source. So he didn't explicitly say that he wanted the taxes paid from the third one, and you kind of suspect that maybe if somebody called that to his attention, he would have worded this differently. So the question became, that ultimately produced, all this litigation, and I'm sure bad feelings that probably will never heal between these total of 5 kids, 4 from the first, 1 from the second. Is this vagueness? What did he mean? Did he realize when he put in the supplement and said, I want the second trust to qualify as a marital deduction, did he realize that meant that all the taxes was going to be thrown onto the third? Well, we don't know exactly, but we do know what the Court of Appeals concluded, but apparently even to them it wasn't clear, a 4-3 decision. So anyway, the court did decide, a majority, ultimately, that this is to all the taxes to be paid by the third trust. So that's what happened. Another thing we don't know about this is, were there provisions for this money to be paid out over a long period of time, or was this money going to be emptied into the kids' hands when they reach a certain age? If you watch this very often, we're emphatic that we think that's not a good idea, no matter how well-rounded and responsible your kids are. It's not about that, though it could be about that, depending on your child. But even if your child is, just a wonderful, mature decision maker, still, you can do that child a much better favor by keeping the money in the trust, having a cooperative trustee, and providing this child an iron, invincible safe for their wealth over many years, whatever misfortune may befall them. An example of which is divorce, bankruptcies, due to a failed business despite their good judgment. Just things happen. Lawsuits. There's just so many risks out there in this world, especially in the United States. But in this case, it's hard to be too critical of Tom Clancy here, because he did go to the trouble to create these trusts. He did care about his children, all of them. And I think that because he made this decision toward the end to add this supplement and make a tax adjustment, I think that he did not realize that it was going to result in all the taxes being thrown into one trust, is my read.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think he knew exactly what would have happened, but he thought it was the right move to make, and unfortunately it wasn't.
Yeah, and we don't know how much was in that trust either. So it could be that, $15 million could very likely have been half of the entire amount, or more than half. So it's hard to feel sorry for anybody, each of whom is getting, a couple $1,000,000 at least. But still, it can affect a lifestyle for sure. And especially grandchildren and great-grandchildren. It's the difference about whether you provide for one generation or you provide for additional generations. So it was certainly, I understood, the 4 children challenging this in court, and it's a shame that it became necessary to do that. I'm sure it's not what Tom Clancy would have wanted that fight to be about. And another point that's worth making is, had it been distributed, the total amount of taxes owed would have been, I think, $12.2 million. So oddly enough, by moving it all to the 4 children from the first marriage, it ended up producing $3 million more, 25% more in taxes than they would otherwise would have been owed. But of course, that's not affected by the first 2 trusts. It's affected just by the third trust. So that was another inefficiency that makes me think, I don't think that Tom Clancy fully understood the implications of this decision. Anyway.
Yeah.
So I hope that you found this interesting. We'll continue to bring you circumstances from which you can learn, often involving celebrities or recognizable names, so that adds a level of interest in addition to the educational opportunity. Let me mention, if you enjoyed this, please hit the like and subscribe buttons. If you have comments, make comments, follow up with us, let us know. Until next time, this has been another episode of Life's Third Act. Take care.
You've been listening to Life's Third Act, a podcast for thriving in retirement, sponsored by Tucker Allen, your estate and elder law advisors. Each week, we discuss topics and answer questions to help you better plan for your future. For more information, visit tuckerallen.com. Subscribe and listen again next week for another edition of Life's Third Act. The choice of a lawyer is an important decision and should not be based solely on advertisements.